The smell of smoke drifted across the French countryside long before the soldiers appeared. It mixed strangely with the sweetness of clover and wildflowers, weaving through the gentle hum of bees at work. To most, it was a quiet summer morning in 1944. But to Henri Delacourt, the owner of the small apiary tucked between two rolling hills, it was the day everything changed, though he wouldn't realize it until much later. Henri was not a soldier, nor a politician, nor any sort of grand hero. He was a beekeeper, born into a line of beekeepers stretching back 5 generations. He knew the rhythm of hives better than he knew the rhythm of people. He could tell you the health of a colony just by listening to the pitch of their buzz. He could harvest honey blindfolded. And he believed deeply, perhaps foolishly, that nothing in the world mattered more than preserving the quiet life he had cultivated with his wife Elise and their son, Luc. But war has a way of finding even those who try hardest to avoid it. For months, Henri had watched German patrols march past his property. Sometimes they stopped to question him. Sometimes they made camp near the edges of his fields. Each time, Henri hid his fear behind a simple smile and the excuse that he was only a beekeeper, a man whose hands were sticky with honey and not worth troubling. He played the part well enough that the soldiers often ignored him. But one morning, a jeep flying an unfamiliar flag rattled over the dirt road, raising clouds of dust that made the bees restless. Henri stepped outside, wiping his hands on his apron, and saw a group of American soldiers jump out. Their leader, Captain James Morgan, strode toward him with a fierce urgency in his eyes. "Sir," Morgan said, "we need a place to set up temporary operations. The Germans are scouting ahead, and we need cover." Henri hesitated. Helping the Allies meant risking everything: his farm, his bees, his life. He looked toward the hills, where German patrols sometimes appeared without warning. But when he turned back to the Americans, he saw the exhaustion etched into their faces, the weight of months of fighting. He saw, most painfully, that they were hardly older than his son. So he nodded. "You can use my barn." The Americans wasted no time. Within minutes, trucks rolled up, soldiers spilled out, maps were spread, radios crackled. The quiet apiary became a hive of its own, chaotic, buzzing with tension, filled with men who understood that every second mattered. Captain Morgan pulled Henri aside. "We're expecting German reinforcements to pass through this valley. If they do, our supply line is done for. Thousands of men could be cut off. We need to stop them, but we also need to hide our equipment until reinforcements arrive." Henri listened carefully. His mind raced. There were only so many places to hide trucks, crates, weaponry. The barn was already dangerously full. The fields were too open. And the forest at the edge of his property was too thin. "What exactly do you need to hide?" Henri asked. Morgan pointed to several tarped-over crates. "A fuel reserve. Enough gasoline to supply an entire armored battalion for the next phase of the push. If the Germans find it, they'll blow it sky high and cripple the advance." Gasoline. Highly flammable, dangerous, and impossible to conceal for long. Henri stared at the crates, then looked toward the rows of hives in the distance. An idea, absurd, ridiculous, began to form. In times of peace, he had experimented with sealing hive boxes to prevent predators from stealing honey. He used a thick paste made of bee resin, propolis, mixed with raw honey. It dried hard, waterproof, and nearly impossible to remove without specialized tools. It also masked scent incredibly well. Honeybees used it to hide the smell of their brood from wasps and rodents. Henri turned back to Morgan. "I think I can hide your gasoline," he said. "But I will need your men to help me with something sticky." 3 hours later, the Americans found themselves doing a job none of them could have imagined that morning. They were coating the gasoline crates, barrels, and containers with layer after layer of a honey-thick mixture Henri blended in giant metal vats usually used for wax melting. Smoke from the small kiln curled upward as the resin softened and mixed. The smell was overwhelming, sweet, earthy, and strange, like hot sap dripping from a sunburnt tree. "Are we making pancakes or fighting a war?" one soldier joked as he smeared resin across a metal drum. Henri chuckled. "If we do this right, you will be fighting a war. And they," he gestured to the distant hum of his bees, "will be your guardians." The mixture hardened quickly on the crates, forming a dull amber shell that absorbed the scent of the fuel. Even standing only a few feet away, Captain Morgan couldn't detect even the faintest smell of gasoline. "This will fool the dogs?" Morgan asked skeptically. Henri nodded. "It will fool anything with a nose. Bees have been disguising the scent of their hives for millions of years. Today, they will disguise yours." The soldiers helped Henri move the coated barrels into the apiary's central grove. Each row of hives formed a natural corridor of buzzing walls. Henri placed the crates between the hives, not touching them but close enough that any curious intruder would quickly rethink approaching. Bees, after all, were territorial. The Americans watched nervously as Henri walked among the hives, calm as ever, placing each barrel with methodical precision. The bees seemed to sense something unusual, their buzzing louder, more anxious, as if they were preparing for some unseen threat. That night, word came that the Germans were advancing faster than expected. The Americans extinguished their lights. The barn fell silent. Henri and his family huddled inside their small farmhouse, praying the Germans would pass through without searching. At dawn, the rumble of engines shook the valley. The Germans arrived in force. Dozens of soldiers spread out across the fields, checking barns, digging into hay, overturning equipment. German shepherds were brought in, sniffing the ground as their handlers barked orders. But when they approached the apiary, the dogs suddenly balked. They whined, growled, and refused to step closer. The nearest German soldier waved a hand dismissively. "They're just bees." And so he stepped forward. The first sting hit him on the ankle, the second on the back of his neck, the third on his cheek. Within seconds, the air erupted in a furious storm of wings. The bees, disturbed by the intrusion and agitated by the unusual movements among their hives, launched into a full defensive assault. Shouts rang out, soldiers flailed, the dogs yelped and fled. The Germans retreated in chaos as hundreds, no, thousands, of bees swarmed them with relentless fury. Henri watched from a distance, heart pounding. He hated seeing anyone suffer, even enemy soldiers. But he also knew that if the Germans discovered the hidden fuel reserve, the Allied advance would be delayed by weeks, maybe months. Countless soldiers would die. The Germans regrouped farther down the valley, far from the apiary. A few angry officers gestured toward Henri's hives, but none dared send their men back in. The bees had created a no-go zone, a natural, living minefield. And beneath their buzzing guardians, the honey-sealed fuel remained untouched. By evening, the Germans moved on, convinced that the farm held nothing of value. When night fell, Captain Morgan approached Henri, gratitude softening the hard lines of his face. "You saved more than our supplies today," Morgan said quietly. "Those crates will refuel the division pushing toward the river. That push will break their line. And that breakthrough, well, that breakthrough could save 1,000,000 men." Henri swallowed hard. He had never thought of himself as someone capable of influencing a war, let alone saving so many lives. "I only did what I could," he said. Morgan smiled. "What you did, Monsieur Delacourt, was everything." A week later, Allied forces swept through the valley in full strength. The division Morgan had supplied spearheaded the attack that liberated an entire region. Word of Henri's unconventional intervention spread, first as whispers among soldiers, then as documented reports, and eventually as legend. But Henri himself received no medals. He asked for none. He wanted none. He returned to his bees, tending them with the same gentle devotion as before. War had touched his land, shaken his life, and nearly destroyed everything he had built. But the bees, his bees, had protected the valley in a way no weapon ever could. Years later, long after the war was over, a group of American veterans visited Henri's farm. They brought with them a plaque engraved with a simple message: "To the beekeeper whose honey saved an army." Henri laughed, embarrassed but deeply moved. He hung the plaque in his barn, where it gathered dust and bees occasionally inspected it with curious antennae. Luke, now older, often asked his father to retell the story. Henri always gave the same humble explanation. "It wasn't me," he'd say. "It was the bees. They knew how to protect their own. And that day, what was theirs, became ours." But the truth was simpler and deeper. It was Henri's knowledge, his quiet mastery of his craft, his bond with the creatures he tended, that had changed the course of a battle. By trusting the natural world, He had created a defense no one could have predicted, one that didn't rely on firepower or strategy but on something far older, far gentler, and far more underestimated. His apiary remained a symbol of unlikely heroism. Soldiers who survived the war would sometimes write letters describing how that one hidden fuel reserve allowed their units to push forward rather than fall back. How that one moment of ingenious camouflage had kept them alive long enough to return home. How some of them believed the war might have stretched on longer if not for the beekeeper and his sticky invention. Henri rarely responded to the letters. He kept them all in a wooden box in his attic, tied with twine. He preferred silence. He preferred the bees. He preferred a world where no one needed to coat gasoline tanks with honey just to save themselves. But history remembers what people try to forget. And history remembered Henri Delacourt as the man whose unlikely knowledge, born of a quiet life among buzzing hives, had shielded an army. In the years that followed, scientists studied his honey resin mixture. Military engineers referenced it in manuals about masking chemical signatures. Historians called it the sticky secret, a strange but brilliant tactic from a war filled with unimaginable strategies. But to Henri, it was simply something he had done because it made sense at the time. When he grew older, he would sit by the hives with his grandson on his knee. The boy would listen wide-eyed as Henri explained how bees protect their home, how they seal cracks, how they outsmart predators. Eventually, inevitably, the boy would ask about the soldiers. "Grandpere," he would say, "did you really save 1,000,000 men?" Henri would chuckle softly. "I didn't," he'd reply. "The bees did." But deep down, he knew better. War can be shaped by generals, strategies, and armies. But sometimes, just sometimes, it can also be shaped by the hands of a beekeeper and the ancient instincts of the tiny creatures he calls family. And in one forgotten valley, on one summer morning in 1944, that unlikely alliance saved more lives than any bullet ever fired. The story of the sticky secret lived on, whispered among veterans, written in archives, and remembered in the quiet hum of the hives that still thrived on Henri's land. A testament to the idea that even in the darkest of times, salvation can come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, it can come from the gentle buzz of bees and the sticky sweetness of honey.